You don't know the first thing about spark plugs. The guests laughed, raising their wine glasses as they pointed to the old man in worn-out clothes at the edge of the pier. The yacht's owner, puffed up with pride, echoed their mockery with a cruel smile. The mechanics, sweaty and defeated, watched in silence, uncomfortable with the scene. The million-dollar engine remained silent, defying all their efforts. But the old man didn't back down. His steady gaze cut through the contempt like an invisible blade, and every second he remained made the air tremble with tension. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The Newport Harbor Marina gleamed like a crown jewel against the Rhode Island coastline, where privilege floated on calm waters and status was measured in yacht length. Crystal-clear morning light danced across polished chrome and pristine white hulls, each vessel representing fortunes that could feed small towns. The air carried the expensive scent of teak oil and salt water, mixed with the subtle fragrance of designer perfumes, worn by women who had never known want. Charles Whitmore III stood on the dock beside his pride and joy. The Maritime Fortune, a 70-foot luxury yacht worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the weathered planks as he paced, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack diamonds. The yacht's massive twin engines, each worth a small fortune, sat silent in their pristine compartment, like sleeping giants, refusing to wake. "How long has it been now?" Charles demanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man accustomed to immediate solutions. Jake Morrison, the lead marine mechanic, Fatelarty, wiped grease from his weathered hands with a dirty rag. His coveralls bore the stains of a dozen failed attempts, and his usually confident demeanor had crumbled into apologetic frustration. "Going on 3 hours, Mr. Whitmore. We've checked everything twice." The small crowd of invited guests maintained a polite distance on the adjacent dock, their champagne flutes catching the sunlight as they whispered among themselves. These were Newport's elite, science thief seats, the kind of people who summered in mansions that overlooked the very waters where their yachts now bobbed. They had arrived expecting a leisurely cruise along the coast, perhaps lunch at Block Island, certainly stories to share at the next charity gala about Charles's magnificent new acquisition. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to an increasingly embarrassing spectacle. "The fuel system's perfect," muttered Tony Rodriguez, Jake's longtime partner. "Electrical's reading normal. Hell, this thing's got more diagnostics than a space shuttle, and every single one says she should be purring like a kitten." Margaret Whitmore, Charles's wife, approached with careful steps, her designer heels negotiating the slight sway of the floating dock. Her cream-colored silk dress probably cost more than Tony made in a month, and her expression carried the practiced patience of a woman who had learned to manage her husband's volcanic temper in public settings. "Perhaps we should consider postponing," she suggested quietly, placing a manicured hand on his arm. "The Hendersons mentioned something about a lovely brunch at the yacht club." Charles shrugged away from her touch, his face flushing red beneath his carefully maintained tan. "Postponing? I didn't spend $2.3 million on a floating paperweight. Margaret, this machine should start when I want it to start." The mechanics exchanged glances loaded with shared frustration. They had reputations to maintain in this harbor, relationships with clients whose boats represented their livelihood. Every minute that passed without the satisfying rumble of those engines was another crack in their professional standing. Dr. Richard Pemberton, Mount-sur Beaujeu, a cardiovascular surgeon and longtime friend of the Whitmores, cleared his throat diplomatically. "These complex systems sometimes have quirks. Remember when Senator Morrison's yacht had that mysterious electrical issue last season? That was a $50,000 diagnostic computer error." Charles snapped. "This is different. This is embarrassment." The word hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Embarrassment was perhaps the only currency that could bankrupt a man in Charles's social circle. Money could be earned back, investments could recover, but public humiliation in front of peers was a stain that lingered like smoke in expensive fabric. Amanda Hartford, the harbor's youngest billionaire at 32, adjusted her designer sunglasses and spoke with the casual confidence of inherited wealth. "Maybe it's just not meant to be today, Charles. The ocean has her moods." "The ocean doesn't have moods," Charles replied tersely. "Machines work, or they don't. That's what I pay people to ensure." Jake climbed down from the engine compartment, his face grim with defeat. Oil streaked his forearms, and his tool belt jangled with the implements of his frustrated trade. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm stumped. Everything looks perfect on paper, but she won't turn over. Not even a cough." The admission fell like a stone into still water. Charles's guests began shifting uncomfortably, some checking their phones for alternative plans, others simply staring out at the horizon where other yachts moved freely across the sparkling surface. It was then that Harold Grayson appeared at the edge of their polished world. He shuffled along the public walkway that bordered the marina, his appearance a stark contrast to everything around him. His clothes were clean but clearly second-hand. Faded khaki pants held up by a cracked leather belt, a blue work shirt that had seen better decades, and shoes that had walked countless miles without complaint. His gray hair stuck out from beneath a worn baseball cap, and he carried a simple wooden walking stick that clicked rhythmically against the wooden planks. The clicking sound reached the group before Harold did, like a metronome marking time in their moment of crisis. Several guests turned toward the sound, their expressions shifting from curiosity to mild disdain as they registered his appearance. Harold paused at the rope barrier that separated the public walkway from the private marina slips. His eyes, sharp despite his weathered face, took in the scene with quiet assessment. The disabled yacht, the frustrated mechanics, the gathering of expensive people standing around looking helpless. "Excuse me," Harold called out, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spoken truth to power before. "Sounds like you folks are having some trouble." The group's attention focused on him like a spotlight, and the quality of that attention was far from welcoming. Charles looked up from his pacing, his expression shifting from frustrated to offended at the intrusion. "I beg your pardon." Charles's voice carried the chill of old money confronting unwanted attention. Harold nodded toward the yacht, his weathered hands steady on his walking stick. "The engines! Sounds like they won't turn over." A ripple of barely contained amusement passed through the gathered guests. Here was an old man in thrift store clothes, offering mechanical advice about a yacht that cost more than he'd likely seen in his lifetime. Dr. Pemberton's voice carried the condescension of assumed superiority. "I think the professionals have the situation well in hand, sir." Harold's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. Sometimes fresh perspective helps. "I've spent some time around marine engines." The clicking of his walking stick against the dock seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. The suggestion hung in the salt-tinged air like fog refusing to lift. Harold Grayson stood at the boundary between worlds, his simple presence somehow magnifying every element that defined the chasm between his worn shoes and their polished deck shoes. Charles Whitmore's laugh came sharp and bitter. "Marine engines? You've spent time around marine engines?" He gestured broadly at the maritime fortune, its sleek lines and gleaming surfaces reflecting the morning sun. "This isn't some fishing boat with an outboard motor, old man. This is precision German engineering worth more than most houses." The gathered guests shifted like a flock of birds sensing disturbance. Amanda Hartford sipped her champagne, hiding a smirk behind crystal. Dr. Pemberton straightened his shoulders, clearly enjoying the social theater unfolding. Even Margaret Whitmore, typically kind to service workers and strangers, seemed to study Harold through the lens of his shabby appearance. Harold absorbed their stares without flinching, his grip steady on the wooden walking stick that had become as much a part of him as his shadow. The clicking sound it made against the dock planks provided a steady counterpoint to the gentle lapping of waves against hulls. "Engineering's engineering," Harold replied simply. "German, American, Japanese. Metal still expands with heat. Electricity still follows the same laws. Fuel still needs to reach combustion chambers." Tony Rodriguez paused in his cleaning of a wrench, something in Harold's tone catching his attention. The old man spoke about engines the way Tony's grandfather had talked about horses, with a familiarity that came from decades of understanding rather than textbook knowledge. Jake Morrison, however, felt his professional pride stinging. 3 hours of failure in front of paying customers was bad enough, without some homeless-looking stranger suggesting he might know better. "Look, Pop, I appreciate the offer, but we've got computerized diagnostics running on this baby that cost more than most cars. If we can't figure it out, I doubt you can." Harold nodded slowly, as if he'd expected exactly this response. Computers are fine tools, but sometimes they can't hear what the machine is trying to tell you. "Hear what the machine is telling you." Charles's voice dripped with theatrical disbelief. "What is this? Some kind of mystical engine whispering? This is the 21st century, not some backwoods garage where they divine problems through spiritual connection with carburetors." The crowd's laughter felt like needles against Harold's weathered skin, but his expression remained peaceful. He had endured far worse storms than social ridicule, and he stood in their midst like an old lighthouse, weathered but unbroken. Amanda Hartford decided to join the entertainment. "Tell us, sir, what exactly is your experience with marine engines? Did you work at a marina?" Harold's pause stretched long enough for the harbor seagulls to wheel overhead, their cries mixing with distant boat horns. When he spoke, his voice carried no defensiveness, no anger at their mockery. "I've been around boats most of my life. Different kinds, different sizes. You learn to listen when something's not right." "Different kinds," Dr. Pemberton pressed, his surgeon's precision turning Harold's words into specimens under examination. "Fishing boats, tugboats, ferry boats, perhaps. Some of each," Harold answered. Margaret Whitmore felt a flutter of discomfort at the growing cruelty in her husband's circle. Harold reminded her of her own grandfather, a man who had built things with his hands and spoken in the same quiet, measured way. But social pressure kept her silent, complicit in the gradual humiliation of this stranger who had only offered help. Charles walked closer to the rope barrier, studying Harold like an entomologist, examining an interesting but inferior species. "You know what I think? I think you're probably one of those old-timers who used to work on lobster boats 30 years ago and thinks that qualifies you to understand modern technology. This yacht has integrated navigation systems, satellite communications, and computerized fuel injection that makes Formula One engines look primitive." "Fuel injection's not new technology," Harold replied mildly. "Rudolf Diesel was working with injection systems in 1885. The computers make diagnostics easier, but the basic principles haven't changed much." The historical reference caught several guests off guard. Amanda Hartford's eyebrows rose slightly behind her sunglasses. Dr. Pemberton, who prided himself on his knowledge of scientific history, found himself surprised by the casual accuracy of the reference. Jake Morrison felt increasingly defensive as his professional competence was being questioned by someone who looked like he lived on Social Security. "Look, old man, I've been working on marine engines for 22 years. I've got certifications from every major manufacturer. I don't need some wannabe mechanic telling me how to do my job." Harold's walking stick clicked once against the dock as he shifted his weight. 22 years is good experience. Must have seen a lot of different problems. Damn right I have. And this isn't any problem I've seen before. Maybe that's the problem, Harold suggested quietly. The words carried more weight than their simple construction should have allowed. Something in Harold's tone suggested layers of meaning that the crowd couldn't quite grasp, but could sense lurking beneath the surface. Charles felt his temper building like pressure in a boiler. The old man's calm persistence in the face of obvious social rejection was somehow more infuriating than outright argument would have been. You know what? I've had enough of this circus. Security! Harold raised a weathered hand. No need for that. I'll move along. But instead of walking away immediately, he took one more long look at the maritime fortune. His eyes traced the yacht's lines with the practiced assessment of someone who understood the relationship between form and function. The hull's design, the prop configuration, the exhaust ports, the way she sat in the water. Beautiful vessel, he said finally. 'Twas shame when something that well-built won't perform. There was something in the way he said it, a note of genuine admiration mixed with diagnostic concern, that made Tony Rodriguez look up from his tools again. Harold wasn't just making conversation. He was making an observation based on specific knowledge. Charles's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Are you actually criticizing my yacht? A boat you've never seen before? Owned by people you don't know, with problems you couldn't possibly understand. Harold met Charles's furious gaze with steady calm. I'm not criticizing anything, sir. Just noting that when something's built to work and it doesn't, there's usually a simple reason. Simple reason? Jake Morrison's voice cracked with indignation. We've run every diagnostic in the book. There's nothing simple about this. Harold nodded again. That same patient acknowledgement. Sometimes the simple things are the hardest to see. He turned to go, his walking stick resuming its steady clicking rhythm against the dock. But his words lingered in the salt air like the echo of a bell, carrying implications that none of them could quite shake. The crowd watched him shuffle away. This strange figure who had appeared from nowhere to offer help they didn't want, and observations they couldn't understand. As his form grew smaller along the public walkway, the clicking of his walking stick fading into the ambient sounds of the harbor, they were left with the uncomfortable sensation that something important had just happened, something they might not recognize until it was too late. Harold Grayson's figure disappeared around the harbormaster's building, but his presence lingered like the scent of rain before a storm. The clicking of his walking stick faded into the symphony of harbor sounds, yet somehow seemed to continue as an echo in everyone's minds. Charles Whitmore straightened his tie with aggressive precision, as if the gesture could restore order to a morning that had slipped beyond his control. Well, that was entertaining. Nothing like local charity cases offering mechanical advice to brighten the day. His guests responded with the practiced laughter of people accustomed to dismissing those beneath their social station. But the sound felt hollow against the backdrop of the still silent engines. Dr. Pemberton adjusted his cufflinks, Margaret smoothed her silk dress, and Amanda Hartford checked her reflection in her phone screen, all unconscious gestures of people reassuring themselves of their elevated status. Jake Morrison felt heat rising in his chest that had nothing to do with the warming morning sun. Crazy old coot probably doesn't know a fuel injector from a carburetor. These days, everyone's an expert. Tony Rodriguez remained quiet, continuing to organize tools that didn't need organizing. Something about Harold's calm certainty kept replaying in his mind. The way the old man had looked at the yacht wasn't the gawking of an impressed bystander. It was the assessment of someone who understood what he was seeing. I still can't believe he just walked up here like he belonged, Amanda Hartford said. her voice carrying the particular disdain of someone who had never doubted her right to exclusivity. The nerve of some people! Margaret Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in her designer heels. Harold had reminded her of her late father, a man who had built their family's modest fortune through patient work and quiet wisdom. She couldn't shake the image of those weathered hands gripping the walking stick, steady despite the social storm swirling around him. "Perhaps we should call the harbor master," Dr. Pemberton suggested. "Let him know about strangers bothering yacht owners. This is supposed to be a secure facility." Charles seized on the suggestion like a drowning man grasping driftwood. "Excellent idea, Richard. Can't have every vagrant who wanders by thinking they can offer unsolicited advice to paying customers." But before anyone could reach for their phone, a new voice cut through their indignation. "Mr. Whitmore." They turned to see Captain Sarah Martinez, the harbor master, approaching with her characteristic stride that spoke of years commanding respect on these docks. Her khaki uniform was crisp despite the humid air, and her dark eyes held the kind of authority that came from managing everything from million-dollar yachts to commercial fishing vessels. "Captain Martinez," Charles replied, his voice immediately shifting to the carefully modulated tone he used with officials who held power over his maritime activities. "I was just about to call you. We've had a vagrant bothering us while we're trying to deal with this engine situation." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "Vagrant? Can you describe him?" "Elderly man, shabby clothes, walking with some kind of stick," Dr. Pemberton provided. "A claim to know about marine engines, quite insistent about offering help we clearly didn't need." A smile tugged at the corner of Sarah's mouth, quickly suppressed. "Gray hair? About 5'8", blue work shirt?" "That's him," Charles confirmed, his voice growing more animated with righteous indignation. "I trust you'll take appropriate action to ensure he doesn't disturb other yacht owners." Sarah looked out toward the harbor entrance, where Harold's figure could still be seen in the distance, making his slow way along the public walkway. When she turned back to the group, her expression carried a weight that made several of them shift uncomfortably. Mr. Whitmore, that vagrant, was Harold Grayson. He's been coming to this harbor longer than I've been alive. The name meant nothing to Charles, but Tony Rodriguez straightened up like he'd been struck by lightning. He knew that name, had heard it whispered in machine shops and boatyards, always with a tone of respect that bordered on reverence. Sarah continued, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering information that would shift everyone's perspective. Harold spent 43 years as chief engineer for the Newport Naval Station. Before that, he served 26 years in the Navy, most of it in the engine rooms of destroyers and cruisers. The champagne glass in Amanda Hartford's manicured hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Dr. Pemberton's confident posture began to sag like a deflating balloon. "He designed propulsion systems that are still in use today," Sarah added, each word landing like a hammer blow against their assumptions. After retirement, he consulted for yacht manufacturers, marine research facilities, and deep-sea exploration companies. That man has forgotten more about marine engines than most people ever learn. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle slapping of waves against hulls and the distant cry of seagulls. Charles felt the familiar sensation of ground shifting beneath his feet, the same vertigo he'd experienced during market crashes and business reversals. Margaret Whitmore closed her eyes, remembering her husband's cruel laughter, her own complicit silence. The cream-colored silk of her dress suddenly felt like a costume, marking her as part of something she wasn't proud of. Jake Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his working tan. In the marine engine community, Harold Grayson's name was legend. The man had solved impossible problems, designed solutions that saved lives, trained generations of engineers who went on to reshape the industry. and Jake had dismissed him as a wannabe mechanic. "Are you saying," Charles began, his voice smaller than before, "that we just insulted and dismissed one of the most respected marine engineers on the East Coast?" Sarah finished. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." Tony Rodriguez set down his wrench with shaking hands. "Jesus Christ! Harold Grayson! I should have recognized the name, but I never expected—" He trailed off, staring in the direction Harold had gone. Amanda Hartford removed her sunglasses, needing to see clearly for the first time that morning. But he looked so ordinary. Ordinary! Sarah's voice carried a hint of steel. Harold Grayson saved 300 sailors when the USS Portland lost power in a North Atlantic storm in 1978. He jury-rigged a propulsion system using parts that weren't supposed to work together and got them to port in conditions that should have killed them all. He's been awarded commendations by 3 different presidents. Each revelation hit the group like a physical blow. They had spent the morning mocking a man whose achievements dwarfed their own, whose quiet expertise could have solved their problem in minutes. Charles felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool harbor breeze. We had no way of knowing. He didn't introduce himself, didn't mention his credentials. Would it have mattered if he had? Sarah asked quietly. Or would you have found other reasons to dismiss him based on his appearance? The question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing each of them to confront their own assumptions and prejudices. They had seen shabby clothes and an old walking stick, and immediately categorized Harold as someone beneath their notice, someone whose opinion couldn't possibly matter. Doctor. Dahinford. Pemberton cleared his throat, his surgeon's confidence crumbling. Perhaps we should, that is, maybe we could. Apologize, Sarah suggested. Try to make amends. Ask for his help after spending 30 minutes humiliating him in front of strangers. Margaret Whitmore found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. Is he still here? Could we? Sarah shook her head. Harold drove to town. He comes by most mornings to walk the docks. Remembers when this place was working shipyard instead of a playground for the wealthy. Today was probably his last visit for a while. The weight of that statement settled over them like fog rolling in from the ocean. They had driven away not just a helpful stranger, but a piece of living history, a connection to the maritime heritage that made their current luxury possible. Jake Morrison threw his wrench into his toolbox with frustration that had nothing to do with mechanical failure. 43 years, naval engineering. And I told him he didn't know fuel injectors from carburetors. The Maritime Fortune sat silent in her slip, her engines as quiet as a tomb. But now their silence seemed less like mechanical failure and more like judgment, as if the yacht herself were disappointed in the behavior of those who claimed to own her. Charles looked out toward the harbor entrance where Harold had disappeared, and for the first time that morning, his expensive yacht seemed less important than the opportunity he had just lost. The afternoon sun climbed higher over Newport Harbor, but the warmth couldn't penetrate the chill that had settled over the group aboard the Maritime Fortune. Sarah Martinez's revelations had transformed their morning of mechanical frustration into something far more uncomfortable, a mirror reflecting their own character. Charles Whitmore stood at the bow of his yacht, staring toward the harbor mouth, where Harold Grayson had disappeared hours earlier. His reflection wavered in the perfectly polished chrome of the boat's fixtures, distorted like his understanding of the morning's events. 43 years, he murmured, the number rolling around in his mind like a stone tumbling down a cliff. 43 years of naval engineering. Behind him, his guests had arranged themselves in uncomfortable clusters, their earlier camaraderie replaced by the awkward silence of people forced to confront their own behavior. The champagne had gone flat in their glasses, the elegant brunch forgotten in the weight of Sarah's words. Margaret Whitmore approached her husband with careful steps, her heels clicking against the teak deck in a rhythm that somehow reminded everyone of Harold's walking stick. "Charles, perhaps we should drive into town, try to find him." "And say what exactly?" Charles's voice carried the bitterness of a man watching his self-image crumble. "Excuse me, Mr. Grayson, we didn't realize you were important enough to deserve basic human decency. We're sorry we only treat people with respect after we've verified their credentials." Dr. Pemberton shifted in his chair, his surgical precision failing him when it came to excising his own shame. "We couldn't have known who he was. He presented himself as just an ordinary man. Just an ordinary man," Amanda Hartford repeated, her voice hollow. "As if ordinary men don't deserve courtesy. As if ordinary men can't possess extraordinary knowledge." Jake Morrison had given up any pretense of working on the engines. His tools lay scattered around the engine compartment like abandoned dreams, and his confidence had evaporated like morning mist. "In my business, reputation is everything. Word gets around when you disrespect someone like Harold Grayson. I might as well start looking for a new career." Tony Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice thick with regret. "My Uncle Miguel worked with him once, back in the 80s. Said Harold could diagnose engine problems just by listening, like he had some kind of sixth sense for mechanical trouble. Called him El Maestro, the master." Sarah Martinez had remained on the dock, watching their group grapple with the consequences of their assumption. As harbor master, she'd seen this dynamic countless times. Wealth and status creating bubbles of arrogance that eventually burst against the reality of human worth. "Captain Martinez," Charles called out, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Is there any way we could contact Mr. Grayson? Perhaps invite him back?" Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral. "Harold doesn't carry a cell phone. Lives simply downtown in a small apartment above Murphy's Deli. Walks everywhere. Takes the bus when he needs to go farther. After what happened this morning, I doubt he'd be interested in returning." The words hit Charles like physical blows. Here was a man whose achievements made Charles's business success seem trivial by comparison, living in simplicity, while Charles flaunted wealth that suddenly felt meaningless. Margaret touched her husband's arm. "We have to try. We have to at least attempt to make this right." "Make it right?" Charles's laugh came out bitter and hollow. "How do you make right 43 years of service to country, decades of expertise, a lifetime of quiet dignity insulted by people who've never built anything more significant than investment portfolios?" Amanda Hartford stood abruptly, her designer dress rustling in the harbor breeze. "This is exactly what's wrong with our world. We've created these bubbles where only certain kinds of success are visible. Only certain kinds of knowledge are valued. We see shabby clothes and assume ignorance. We see wealth and assume wisdom." Her words carried the sting of personal recognition. Amanda had inherited her fortune at 25, had never worked with her hands, had never created anything beyond financial instruments that moved money around without producing value. Yet she'd felt entitled to judge Harold based on his appearance. Dr. Pemberton removed his expensive sunglasses, rubbing his eyes like a man waking from a troubling dream. "In medicine, we're taught to observe before making diagnoses, look at symptoms, listen to patients, gather information before drawing conclusions. Yet today, I diagnosed a man's worth based on his clothing." Jake Morrison climbed out of the engine compartment, c'est tout, his movements heavy with defeat and shame. "You know what the worst part is? He probably could have fixed this in 10 minutes. 43 years of naval engineering, and we wouldn't even let him look." The truth of that statement settled over them like a weight. Their mechanical problem remained unsolved, but it had become secondary to their moral failure. The engine's silence now seemed less like malfunction and more like judgment. Tony Rodriguez picked up Harold's earlier words like a detective examining evidence. He said sometimes the simple things are hardest to see. Said computers are fine tools, but sometimes they can't hear what the machine is trying to tell you. Hear what the machine is telling you, Charles repeated slowly. We thought he was talking nonsense. New Age, mechanical mysticism. But he wasn't, was he? Margaret asked quietly. He was talking about experience, about the kind of understanding that comes from decades of listening to engines, learning their language. Sarah Martinez stepped closer to the yacht's edge, her expression softening slightly. Harold has a saying, engines don't lie, but diagnostics sometimes miss the truth. He can identify problems that computerized systems can't detect because he listens with more than just instruments. The group fell silent again, each person lost in their own reckoning with the morning's events. The harbor around them continued its eternal rhythm, waves lapping against hulls, seagulls calling overhead, the distant horn of a ferry, but their perfect world had been fundamentally disrupted. Charles looked down at his Italian leather shoes, at the polished deck of his expensive yacht, at the crystal champagne flutes his guests had abandoned. All of it suddenly seemed like elaborate props in a play about people who had forgotten how to see beyond their own reflection. We need to find him, he said finally, his voice carrying a conviction that hadn't been there before. Not just to fix the engines, but because we owe him an apology, a real apology. Margaret nodded, relief flooding her face. Yes, we need to try to make this right. Even if he won't accept our apology. Amanda Hartford picked up her purse, checking for her keys. I'll drive. We should go now, before we lose our nerve or convince ourselves this doesn't matter. Dr. Pemberton stood as well, his movement decisive. We all participate. We all face what we did. Jake Morrison hesitated, his professional reputation warring with his conscience. What if he won't see us? What if we make things worse? Sarah Martinez answered from the dock, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had mediated countless human conflicts in her role as harbor master. Harold Grayson has never been cruel to anyone in all the years I've known him. He won't humiliate you the way you humiliate, but he won't forget either. The question is whether you're seeking his forgiveness or his expertise. Charles met her gaze directly for the first time that day. Both and neither. We're seeking the chance to be better people than we were this morning. The Maritime Fortune continued to sit silent in her slip, her engines as quiet as ever. But somehow, the quality of that silence had changed. It no longer felt like failure waiting to be fixed, but like patience waiting for wisdom. And wisdom, they were beginning to understand, sometimes came in forms they didn't expect. Downtown Newport moved at a different rhythm than the polished Marina District. Here, weathered buildings held the authentic patina of working-class history, and the streets carried the sounds of real life rather than curated luxury. The group from the Maritime Fortune felt conspicuous in their expensive clothes as they parked outside Murphy's Deli, their privilege marking them like bright paint in a world of earned shadows. Charles Whitmore stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the modest apartment windows above the delicatessen. Somewhere behind one of those plain glass panes lived a man whose achievements dwarfed Charles's entire biography, yet who called this simple place home. The contrast between Harold's quiet dignity and their own ostentatious display of wealth had never felt more stark. Second floor, apartment 2B. Sarah Martinez had told them before they left the harbor. But don't expect him to be eager for company. Harold values his privacy, especially after mornings like today. Margaret Whitmore touched her husband's elbow gently. We have to try, Charles. We can't leave things as they are. The deli's front door chimed as they entered, bringing the mingled scents of pastrami, fresh bread, and coffee. Behind the counter, a stocky man in his 50s looked up from slicing meat, his eyes taking in their expensive clothes with mild curiosity. Help you folks?" he asked, his Boston accent thick as the sandwiches he was preparing. Charles cleared his throat, feeling awkward in a way his wealth usually protected him from experiencing. "We're looking for Harold Grayson. We understand he lives upstairs." The man's expression immediately shifted, becoming protective. "You reporters? Harold's not interested in interviews. Told you people that before." "No, we're not reporters," Margaret said quickly. We owe him an apology." The sandwich maker, whose name tag read Murphy, studied their faces with the shrewdness of someone who had sized up customers for 30 years. "You, the yacht people from this morning." The question hit like cold water. News traveled fast in small communities, and their behavior at the marina had apparently already made its way through the local network of working people who actually kept the harbor running. Amanda Hartford stepped forward, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "Yes, we are. We made terrible assumptions. We were wrong." Murphy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Harold came through here about an hour ago. Quiet as usual, but quieter. Said something about rich folks who couldn't see past their own reflection." He paused, studying their faces. "That sound familiar?" Dr. Pemberton removed his sunglasses entirely, meeting Murphy's gaze directly. "It sounds accurate. We treated a good man badly because we couldn't see past our own prejudices." The honesty in his voice seemed to soften Murphy's defensive stance slightly. He finished wrapping the sandwich he'd been making and called toward the back of the shop. "Maria, watch the counter." A woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and giving the wealthy visitors the same protective assessment her husband had. Murphy gestured toward a narrow staircase beside the deli counter. "Harold's probably up there, but he might not want to see you. Guy's been through enough grief from people who should know better." Charles felt heat rise in his chest, but it wasn't the familiar anger of his wounded pride. This was shame, pure and simple, at being labeled accurately by people whose opinion he'd never considered valuable before today. "We understand," he said quietly, "but we have to try." Murphy led them up the narrow stairs, each step creaking under the weight of their collective guilt. The hallway above was clean but worn, with overhead lighting that spoke of utility rather than decoration. At apartment 2B, Murphy knocked gently. "Harold, it's Tom Murphy. Got some folks here, want a word." The silence stretched long enough for them to hear sounds from neighboring apartments. A television, children playing, the ordinary symphony of people living ordinary lives. When Harold's voice finally came through the door, it carried no anger, only quiet resignation. "I'm not interested in continuing this morning's conversation, Tom." Murphy looked at the group behind him, his expression making clear that this was their moment to prove they deserved Harold's time. Charles stepped forward, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority. "Mr. Grayson, this is Charles Whitmore. I own the yacht where I need to apologize to you, sir." Another long silence. Then the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the door. When it opened, Harold Grayson stood before them in the same simple clothes, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond mild curiosity. His walking stick leaned against the doorframe within easy reach. "Mr. Whitmore," Harold said simply, his voice carrying neither welcome nor hostility. Charles found himself looking into eyes that held depths of experience he couldn't fathom. Standing in this narrow hallway, facing a man whose achievements made his own seem trivial, Charles felt smaller than he had since childhood. "Mr. Grayson, Charles struggled with words that had never been difficult before. "We were inexcusably rude to you this morning. We made assumptions based on your appearance, and we were wrong, completely, shamefully wrong." Harold's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You were protecting your social space. Happens all the time." The casual acceptance of their behavior somehow made it worse than anger would have. Margaret stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite control. "Mr. Grayson, we learned who you are after you left, your service record, your achievements. But that's not why we should have treated you with respect. We should have shown basic human decency regardless of your credentials." Harold nodded slowly, his gaze moving from face to face in the group. "Most people judge by appearances. It's human nature." Amanda Hartford found herself fighting back tears she hadn't expected. "It's not acceptable human nature, Mr. Grayson. We failed as human beings this morning, and we're sorry." Harold looked past them toward Murphy, who had been watching the exchange with the protective interest of a longtime neighbor. "Tom, these people drove all the way here to apologize." "Seems like it," Murphy replied, his tone still reserved. Harold stepped back slightly, creating space in his doorway. "Would you like to come in? I don't have much to offer in the way of refreshments, but the conversation might be more comfortable inside." The apartment was small but meticulously organized. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with technical manuals, naval histories, and engineering texts that looked well-worn from frequent consultation. A simple desk by the window held drafting tools and papers covered with precise mechanical drawings. Everything spoke of a mind that remained actively engaged despite retirement. Charles found himself studying the framed photographs on Harold's walls. Ships, engine room, groups of uniformed men standing before massive machinery. These were the visual records of a life spent in service to something larger than personal wealth. "Please, sit wherever you can find space," Harold said, settling into a worn but comfortable chair near the window. His walking stick rested against his knee, and his weathered hands folded over its carved handle. Dr. Pemberton chose a straight-backed chair near the bookshelf, his eyes scanning titles that revealed the breadth of Harold's knowledge. "Mr. Grayson, I have to ask, how did you resist the urge to tell us exactly who we were dealing with, to put us in our place when we were being so arrogant?" Harold's slight smile was the first genuine warmth he'd shown since opening the door. "What would that have accomplished? You weren't interested in my credentials. You were interested in maintaining your sense of superiority. Proving my worth wouldn't have changed your hearts." The insight hit like a surgical blade, precise and undeniably accurate. They had come seeking Harold's expertise only after learning of his achievements, not because they'd recognized their moral failure. Margaret settled carefully on a small sofa, her silk dress seeming absurdly out of place in Harold's practical world. "You're right. We came here because we learned you were important. Not sanan. Not because we understood that everyone deserves respect. But you did come," Harold observed quietly. "That suggests something worth encouraging." Jake Morrison had remained near the door, his discomfort evident in every line of his body. "Mr. Grayson, in my profession, your name is legend. I've been fixing marine engines for over 20 years, and I've heard stories about your work since I was an apprentice. When I realized who you were, Christ, I wanted to disappear." Harold's expression softened slightly. "Jake Morrison, isn't it? Tom Rodriguez's partner?" Jake nodded, surprised at being recognized. "Tony mentioned you both this morning. Said you've built a good reputation at the harbor. One mistake doesn't erase 20 years of competent work." The kindness in Harold's response somehow made Jake feel worse, rather than better. Here was a man offering forgiveness that hadn't been earned, grace that hadn't been deserved. Amanda Hartford leaned forward in her chair, her usual composure cracking. "Mr. Grayson, how do we become better people? How do we learn to see beyond our own privilege?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving to the window where he could see the harbor in the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent observing human nature. "Same way you learn to understand engines, Miss Hartford. You listen more than you talk. You assume you don't know everything. You respect the complexity of what you're dealing with. whether it's a machine or a human being. Charles found his voice again, though it came out smaller than usual. Mr. Grayson, is there any way we could convince you to look at our yacht? Not because of your reputation, but because we'd be honored to learn from someone who clearly understands things we don't. Harold's walking stick clicked once against the floor as he shifted position, considering the request. Your engines still won't start. No, sir. Jake and Tony have tried everything they can think of. Harold nodded slowly, his gaze moving to the window again where the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward evening. Sometimes the hardest problems have the simplest solutions, but you have to be willing to see them. The words carried implications beyond marine mechanics, and everyone in the room understood that Harold was talking about more than engines. Downtown Newport felt different from the polished Marina district as Charles Whitmore stood outside Murphy's Deli, staring at the modest apartment windows above. Somewhere behind those plain glass panes lived a man whose achievements dwarfed Charles's entire biography. Second floor, apartment 2B, Sarah Martinez had told them. Don't expect him to be eager for company. The deli's front door chimed as they entered. Behind the counter, a stocky man looked up from slicing meat, his eyes taking in their expensive clothes with mild curiosity. "Help you folks?" he asked. "We're looking for Harold Grayson," Charles said awkwardly. "See, we owe him an apology." The man's expression immediately shifted, becoming protective. "You the yacht people from this morning?" The question hit like cold water. Amanda Hartford stepped forward. "Yes, we are. We made terrible assumptions. We were wrong." Murphy studied their faces with 30 years of customer assessment experience. "Harold came through here about an hour ago, quieter than usual. Said something about rich folks who couldn't see past their own reflections." Dr. Pemberton removed his sunglasses. "It sounds accurate. We treated a good man badly because we couldn't see past our prejudices." Murphy led them upstairs to apartment 2B and knocked gently. "Harold, it's Tom Murphy. Got some folks here want a word." Silence stretched until Harold's voice came through the door, carrying quiet resignation. "I'm not interested in continuing this morning's conversation, Tom." Charles stepped forward. "Mr. Grayson, this is Charles Whitmore. I need to apologize to you, sir." Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. When the door opened, Harold stood before them, his weathered face showing mild curiosity. "Mr. Whitmore," Harold said simply. Charles found himself looking into eyes, holding depths of experience he couldn't fathom. "We were inexcusably rude this morning. We made assumptions based on your appearance, and we were shamefully wrong." Harold's expression didn't change. "You were protecting your social space. Happens all the time." The casual acceptance made it worse than anger would have. Margaret stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "We learned who you are after you left, your service record, your achievements. But that's not why we should have treated you with respect." Harold nodded slowly. "Most people judge by appearances. It's human nature." "It's not acceptable human nature," Amanda said, fighting unexpected tears. Harold stepped back, creating space. "Would you like to come in?" The apartment was small but organized. Bookshelves lined walls filled with technical manuals and naval histories. A desk held drafting tools and mechanical drawings. Framed photographs showed ships, engine rooms, groups of uniformed men before massive machinery. Harold settled into a worn chair near the window. "Please, sit wherever you can find space." Dr. Pemberton chose a chair near the bookshelf. "How did you resist telling us exactly who we were dealing with, putting us in our place when we were being so arrogant?" Harold's slight smile showed the first genuine warmth. "What would that have accomplished? You weren't interested in my credentials. You were interested in maintaining superiority. Proving my worth wouldn't have changed your hearts." Margaret settled on a small sofa. "You're right. We came because we learned you were important. Not because we understood everyone deserves respect. But you did come, Harold observed. That suggests something worth encouraging. Jake Morrison had remained near the door. In my profession, your name is legend. When I realized who you were, I wanted to disappear. Harold's expression softened. One mistake doesn't erase 20 years of competent work, Jake. The kindness somehow made Jake feel worse. Here was forgiveness that hadn't been earned. Amanda leaned forward. How do we become better people? How do we learn to see beyond our privilege? Harold was quiet, his eyes moving to the harbor visible in the distance. Same way you learn engines. Listen more than you talk. Assume you don't know everything. Respect complexity, whether it's machines or human beings. Charles found his voice. Is there any way we could convince you to look at our yacht? Not because of your reputation, but because we'd be honored to learn from you. Harold's walking stick clicked against the floor as he considered. Your engine still won't start. No, sir. Harold nodded slowly. See, sometimes the hardest problems have the simplest solution, but you have to be willing to see them. The words carried implications beyond mechanics, and everyone understood Harold was talking about more than engines. The afternoon sun painted Newport Harbor in golden hues as Harold Grayson approached the maritime Fortune Fee's engine compartment. His weathered hands gripped his walking stick as he studied the massive twin engines with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades listening to mechanical hearts. Tell me what you've tried, Harold said simply. Jake Morrison detailed their hours of diagnostic work while Harold listened without interruption, occasionally nodding. When the explanation finished, Harold moved closer to the engines, and Tintihan Tanindri, his small flashlight scanning components that had already been checked multiple times. Hand me that mirror, Tony, Harold requested, pointing to the inspection mirror. Tony Rodriguez passed the tool, watching as Harold angled it to examine hidden areas. The old engineer's movements were economical, guided by pattern recognition developed over 43 years. There, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying discovery. Shine your light here. Tony. The beam illuminated what appeared to be a perfect fuel line connection. Look at the bracket holding it, Harold instructed. Not the connection, the bracket. Jake leaned in, his trained eyes following Harold's direction. Suddenly, he saw it. The brackets cracked. Hairline fracture, Harold confirmed. Probably happened during installation. The connection seals perfectly. But that crack allows just enough vibration to interrupt fuel flow during ignition. Tony stared at the tiny crack their diagnostic equipment had missed. Why didn't our pressure tests catch it? Harold smiled. Static tests don't account for dynamic stress. When the starter engages, vibration from that cracked bracket disrupts fuel delivery for the split second needed for ignition. Jake felt like he was witnessing magic. Hey, how did you spot it so quickly? Pattern recognition, Harold replied. I've seen similar failures. Perfect diagnostics, but no ignition usually means something's happening in microseconds that equipment can't capture. Charles stepped forward, amazed. You found in 10 minutes what professionals couldn't find in hours. Harold leaned on his walking stick. Jake and Tony are excellent mechanics, but they were looking for complex problems matching expensive equipment. Sometimes experience teaches you to suspect simple explanations first. Amanda Hartford shook her head in wonder. You said this morning that simple things are hardest to see. Machines and people aren't different, Harold replied. Both can fail for simple reasons, overlooked when you expect complicated explanations. Tony was already gathering repair tools. Would you supervise while we fix this? I'd consider it education. I'd be honored, Harold said. As the mechanics began the straightforward bracket replacement, Harold settled into a deck chair Charles offered. The repair took 30 minutes and cost $50 in parts. When Jake pressed the ignition switch, The Maritime Fortune S engines turned over immediately, their synchronized rumble rising to a smooth, powerful purr. The sound was magnificent after hours of stubborn silence. A cheer rose from the watching group. Charles felt relief flood through him, mixed with genuine gratitude toward the man he had dismissed that morning. Harold's face showed quiet satisfaction. Beautiful sound. Those Munich engineers would be proud. Mr. Grayson, Charles said, his voice carrying newfound humility. This morning I thought I had a mechanical problem. I had no idea I actually had a character problem. My own. Harold's weathered face showed understanding, rather than judgment. Most of us have character problems, Mr. Whitmore. The fortunate ones get opportunities to recognize them. Margaret approached Harold carefully. You've given us a gift today that goes beyond fixing engines. You've shown us what real dignity looks like. Harold's eyes crinkled with warmth. Mrs. Whitmore, dignity isn't something anyone can give or take away. It's something we carry inside ourselves. Jake finished securing his tools, but seemed reluctant to leave. Mr. Grayson, would you visit our shop sometime? Share stories with young mechanics who could learn your approach. Harold considered the request. I'd enjoy that. Teaching keeps the mind sharp. Charles gestured toward Harold with genuine respect. He identified a problem our diagnostic equipment couldn't detect. Harold began gathering his simple tools, just a flashlight and mirror, basic instruments that had revealed what thousands of dollars of diagnostics missed. Please, let us compensate you, Charles offered. Harold shook his head firmly. I didn't help for money, Mr. Whitmore. I helped because that's what neighbors do. The word neighbors carried unexpected weight. Harold had claimed them as community despite their behavior. How do we thank you properly? Margaret asked. Harold's walking stick clicked against the deck. By remembering these lessons, Mrs. Whitmore. By treating the next person who looks different with the respect you wish someone had shown me this morning. As Harold prepared to leave, the Maritime Fortune dirred. S engines provided perfect soundtrack to the afternoon's transformation. The mechanical harmony represented more than repaired equipment. It symbolized the possibility of human harmony, achieved through understanding and respect. The clicking of Harold's walking stick faded into the harbor's evening symphony, but the lessons he'd taught would echo long after the engine sounds disappeared into ocean breeze. 3 weeks later, the Maritime Fortune cut smoothly through waters off Block Island, her engines purring with Harold Grayson's restored perfection. But the yacht's passengers were transformed people. Charles Whitmore stood at the helm, his expression peaceful rather than commanding. The ocean had become a teacher, vast and patient, reminding him of forces larger than ego. Margaret sat reading maritime history borrowed from Harold's library. Her silk dresses had been replaced by practical sailing clothes, her hands showing honest calluses from learning to work with ropes. 20 degrees to starboard, Jake Morrison called from the bow. Currents pushing us east. Charles adjusted course with comfortable confidence. Harold had suggested anyone owning a boat should understand how it worked completely, and Charles had embraced the education enthusiastically. Tony Rodriguez emerged from the engine compartment. Everything running perfectly. Those engines are happy. The mechanics had become regular crew on Charles's weekend sails. Galituanius, their relationship transformed from hired help to respected colleagues. Harold sat in the cockpit with Dr. Pemberton, discussing deep-sea exploration engineering. Harold had become a regular companion, though their gatherings now occurred at Murphy's Deli and neighborhood establishments where conversation flowed as freely as expensive wine once had. Pressure differentials at those depths create problems most people never consider, Harold explained, sketching diagrams in air. It's not just surviving pressure, it's functioning reliably under conditions that would crush conventional machinery. Amanda Hartford listened with rapt attention, having become Harold's unofficial biographer, recording stories for young mechanics who gathered at educational sessions. Sarah Martinez had joined for the day's sail, representing the broader community that embraced their transformed group, such as Tessa's Tunning Few. You know what strikes me about your stories, Harold, Margaret said. You never position yourself as the hero. Always teamwork, learning from others. Harold's slight smile acknowledged her observation. Real solutions come from people working together, sharing knowledge. No one person has all the answers. They sailed toward their destination, not Block Island's resort marina, but the working harbor where Harold had arranged to meet retired Navy engineers who gathered monthly to share stories. "There's something I need to tell you," Charles said, his voice carrying weight that made everyone look up. "I've made a decision about the Maritime Fortune." The group tensed. "I'm donating her to the Maritime Education Foundation. She'll teach seamanship and marine engineering to young people who couldn't otherwise afford access to equipment like this." Silence was broken only by wind and water. Then Harold's quiet voice. "That's generous, Charles." "It's right," Charles replied. "This boat taught me lessons, but those lessons should be available beyond my social circle. Kids who dream of working with ships deserve the chance to learn on proper equipment." Margaret squeezed her husband's hand, her eyes bright with pride. "What about sailing?" Dr. Pemberton asked. "You've come to love it." Charles smiled, the expression transforming his face. "Harold's teaching me to restore a 1960s wooden sailboat, something I can work on with my hands, maintain myself. Real sailing." Tony grinned. "That old Pearson 35? She's beautiful under the peeling paint. Lot of work, though." "Good," Charles replied. "I'm looking forward to learning something I can't buy." As they approached the working harbor where Harold's friends waited, Amanda reflected on that morning 3 weeks earlier. The memory seemed to belong to strangers, their arrogance, assumption, complete inability to see beyond appearances. "Harold, you could have told us who you were immediately. Why didn't you?" Harold considered carefully. "Because telling you wouldn't have taught anything. You needed to discover what you were capable of becoming. You let us fail, so we could learn." Dr. Pemberton nodded. "I let you be who you were, so you could choose who you wanted to be," Harold corrected gently. Sarah pointed toward the harbor, where older men waited beside boats showing honest wear. "There are your friends, Harold." As the Maritime Fortune made final approach, Charles reflected on the journey from humiliating mechanical failure to the most meaningful friendships of his life. Harold stood slowly, preparing to disembark into a community where he was valued for knowledge, character, and willingness to share both with anyone humble enough to learn. "Ready to meet some real engineers?" Harold asked. Charles nodded. "Ready to learn, Harold. Ready to listen." The engines settled into silence, but authentic human connection filled the air. Voices in greeting, laughter on harbor breeze, conversations that would continue past sunset. Harold stepped onto the dock, walking stick clicking against weathered planks, introducing new friends to old ones. The circle widened to embrace them all, and in that expansion lay true treasure. Understanding that wisdom couldn't be measured by appearances, that community was built through respect rather than status, and that the most valuable lessons often came from the most unexpected teachers. This story reminds us that every person we encounter carries invisible stories of courage, wisdom, and experience. In our rush to judge by appearances, we often miss opportunities to learn from extraordinary individuals whose quiet dignity puts our own assumptions to shame. Harold Grayson represents the countless unsung heroes around us, veterans, retirees, working people whose knowledge could enrich our lives if only we approached them with humility instead of prejudice. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your expectations of importance, remember the harbor's secret. Wisdom often comes dressed in work clothes, and the most profound lessons await those humble enough to listen. Share this story with someone who might need reminding that respect should be given freely, not earned through credentials, and that the most valuable human connections often begin when we set aside our assumptions and simply see each other clearly. What unexpected teacher has changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this tale of transformation touched your heart, subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary, ordinary people who make our world richer than we realize.